Hey folks, we are going to try this again. I think I've gotten through all of my phone calls of the internet's down, the internet's down, the internet's down. But I don't want to put this off to tomorrow, although now both classes have lost out on it, because it would be a lot to cram into one class, and we really need to finish this unit this week, and it doesn't need Friday. So I'm just going to go ahead and record a lecture on the Wanderer. The notes are available to you in the class folder if you need them. And then, as always, if you have any questions or need to talk it through, feel free to message me, or we can come into a small group or a private conference before you open up that test tomorrow. So we are looking at The Wanderer today, the second of our 3 poems from the Executor book, which is the first recorded anthology of Anglo-Saxon literature. So Anglo-Saxon literature, of course, existed before it, because Beowulf is older than this, but this is the first time that it was put together in a collection. All right, I'm so thrown off my game, so this could get entertaining because I'm going to do it in one take, no matter what. All right, the lonely traveler longs for grace, for the mercy of God. Grief hangs on his heart and follows the frost-cold foam. He cuts in the sea, sailing endlessly, aimlessly, in exile. So look at word choice here. That's what we're going to look at with the first stanza. And anytime you're working with poetry, word choice becomes very important in pulling out lines to analyze. And so we open with this tone of hopelessness and isolation. You know, the word choice, lonely, endless, aimless, exile, very much evokes the overall tone of this poem from the very opening. And what we get here is very different than yesterday's poem, because this is definitely not his preferred lifestyle. I mean, even that title, the idea of wandering around, is attached to this inferred hopelessness. So unlike our seafarer who clung to that isolated life, who thrust himself away from society and civilization, here we're introduced to a speaker who immediately seems to be mourning his loneliness. What we also see differently here is we're not going to transition into a religious message, but we begin with it, and it's carried throughout the poem here as he opens the poem with this plea to God, just this tone that presents him to us, the reader, as someone who is unfavored, someone who is outcasted, and not by choice. Fate has opened a single port, memory. He sees his kinsmen slaughtered again and cries, "I've drunk too many lonely dawns, gray with mourning." So again, in working with poetry, we want to look at word choice. And when we're talking about someone traveling, especially in the place and the time this would have been referring to, they would have been traveling by sea. And so port has a very tangible physical definition here, as a ship would have come into the different ports, because we get the idea that he's on the run, he's in hiding. But look what the poet plays with. So of all these different lands he goes to, there's really just one single port, one place he returns to, one place that he lives, and that is his memory. And then the other word that is worthy of a look here is mourning. Now, I will freely admit, this is one of those places where I might be going English teacher, and analyzing what was not necessarily meant to be analyzed, in which case it's still worth analysis, because we're going to call it irony. But, the British love their U's, and so that mourning with a U typically could just be a British spelling. But think what happens with this poem. When we say that the dawn is lonely is gray with mourning, it could be the idea that the skies are gray. There is no sun. But at the same time, every day is a new beginning, and it's not one that is welcomed with him. Every day reminds him of what he has lived through and what he is missing. Once there were men to whom my heart could hurry, hot with open longing. They're long since dead. My heart has closed on itself, quietly learning that silence is noble, and sorrow nothing that speech can cure. Sadness has never driven sadness off. Fate blows hardest on a bleeding heart. So those who thirst for glory smother secret weakness and longing, neither weep nor sigh nor listen to the sickness in their souls. So I, lost and homeless, forced to flee the darkness that fell on the earth, and my Lord. And so we get here some definite background, right? So why is he alone? And we learn that the Lord that he served and all of his fellow kinsmen have been killed. And we don't learn more than that. And when I read this, I took it as he was the lone survivor. So he now has no society in which he belongs. And maybe it's not safe for him to be where he once was, and that's why he aimlessly wanders. I have had students in class before who had a different reading of this, and their reading of it was that perhaps the reason he is so plagued by this memory is because he's guilty, and that it is he who executed his kinsmen and his Lord. I have a problem with that. I don't think it works out given the whole poem, but it is worth pause and consideration. It would make a good discussion if we were actually discussing this. So what we see here, though, that's worth pulling out, and we're going to see develop throughout the poem, is unlike the seafarer, he misses that connection to a society, and he's expressing this filial love, right? And when we look back at how men wrote about the relationships with men during this time and for another 500 years, well into Shakespeare's time, there's this idea of brotherhood and that only men were worthy of love. Women had other purposes. But it's written about in almost this passionate tone that a modern audience gives pause to, but we can't because we're taking it out of context. So what we have expressed here are those Anglo-Saxon virtues of friendship and loyalty, translated to filial love, which simply means a brotherly love, that all that he held dear has been ripped from him, and he is now wandering about aimlessly. All right, so this is in the same section. So there's this theme introduced of not only physical isolation, which he apparently doesn't have a choice of since his men are all killed, but choosing to be isolated within oneself. Something that I think in later slides we'll refer to as noble silence. So he criticizes here. Have we gotten this far in it? Hold on, I've lost my place. 322. Okay. I've read over these poems so much today that they're all blurring as I was putting together the test for you. I apologize. I told you one take. This is real. Okay. So this idea of noble silence, that he is saying that, not only is he physically isolated, even if that's by choice, but he has to remain silent. And so, this idea of he has no one to talk to and he can't tell his story because there's something there that's untowardly that we don't know what it is. But think about what he's saying. He reiterates the idea that, nothing in speech can cure, that those who thirst for glory smother secret weakness and longing. So he is criticizing a society of self-promotion and boasting. He is saying the louder you speak, the more that you have to say, the more glory that you wish for, you're really just covering up your own weakness and inadequacies. Now, this is completely opposite to what we've seen so far in this Anglo-Saxon culture, right? Especially with Beowulf, that the idea of boasting, we are told that we just have to accept that as the cultural norm in Anglo-Saxon society. But this is a transition society. We're at the end of it and we're moving into the next era. And here, especially with the introduction section of religion, and this idea of focus not on self but something greater, is now criticizing that idea of these hollow boasts. So just go do what you're going to do and do it quietly. Let your deeds speak for you. But he's saying there's, the nobility lies in silence, in the idea of carrying your own burden, not in boasting who you are and what you do. And that's definitely a new thought in looking at the culture of the Anglo-Saxons in their writing. Leaving everything, weary with winter, I wandered out on the frozen waves, hoping to find a place, a people, a lord to replace my lost one. No one knew me. Now no one offered comfort, allowed me feasting or joy. How cruel a journey I've traveled, sharing my bread with sorrow alone, an exile in every land. So we continue with the use of weather and the use of the sea. That's actually one of the essay questions, so I'm going to drop that hint here to reward those of you who actually went back and watched this. How is nature or weather used to evoke this tone of loneliness and hardship? We do see it with all three poems. So look at the use of alliteration. It happens a lot in this poem. And anytime you see alliteration, that repetition of the same consonant sound, it's definitely helping to create a tone, and weary, wintered, wandered. There's definitely connection in those words with the theme being established here. There's lots of symbols of community included in this little section. The idea of he has no one to feast with, he has no one to share bread with, and those are symbols. Think about the great mead halls that'll be referred to later in the poem. Those symbols of community are denied to him. He has nowhere to go, no one to eat with. He travels to several places and is able to find no relief. Okay, alone and exile in every land. Could only be told by telling my footsteps. For who can hear, friendless and poor, and know what I've known? Since the long, cheerful nights when young and yearning with my Lord I yet feasted, most welcome of all, that warmth is dead. He only knows who needs his Lord as I do, eager for long missing aid. He only knows who never sleeps without the deepest dreams of longing. Sometimes it seems I see my Lord, kiss and embrace him, bend my hands and head to his knee, kneeling as though he still sat enthroned, ruling his thanes. And I open my eyes, embracing the air, and see the brown sea billows heave. So what do we get in this section? We definitely get further characterization of our speaker. And we're talking about this poem in the terms that we would use for other literature, right? Typically, when we talk about poems, we talk about metaphors and similes and personification, and we see some of that happening here. But again, remember that this poetic verse was the way in which stories were first recorded. So we're using words like characterization and setting and terms that are really saved later for short stories and larger pieces. But in this original work, this was the way it was written. And it was written that way because, again, we're in this transitioning society of everything being told orally to it being transcribed. And when it was told orally, imagine having to memorize all three of these poems to go and tell it to crowds. And so you would do that by giving it a certain rhythm and rhyme and syllables per line to help you. So we learn more about our speaker here. He's characterized a little bit more. And we see that he was in a subservient position. And he misses the leader under which he served. So there's possibly, some tension here that he's longing for the servitude. We could look at this and we wanted to modernize it. We would have that idea of you're free. The person you had to serve is slaughtered. The men are slaughtered. You get a do-over. But he's not embracing this new freedom, that in this society in which loyalty and servitude are important ideals, he now has no one to serve with. He has no one to be loyal to. So his identity as a man is lost. And so that's something interesting to look at as you analyze isolation in working with tomorrow's poem and in working with the essay questions on the test. In what ways does isolation affect your identity? That we had a character who chose to be isolated because that reinforced what he found important. And here we have a character who did not choose it. And without his community, he has no idea who he is or what to do, and he wanders aimlessly. All right. Hashtag more birds. How loathsome become the frozen waves to a weary heart. In this brief world, I cannot wonder that my mind is set on melancholy, because I never forget the fate of men robbed of their riches. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped a huge section. Back up. See the seabirds bathe, spreading their white feathered wings. Watch the frost and the hail and the snow, and heavy in heart I long for my Lord, alone and unloved. Sometimes it seems I see my kin, and greet them gladly, give them welcome, the best of friends. They fade away, swimming soundlessly out of sight, leaving nothing. All right, so again, it's just ironic that, we had birds as symbolism in the last one, and we see a brief mention of it here. We won't see birds in the next one. We do see the continuation of nature in terms of weather and landscape. So, there is this idea of these symbols of freedom and innocence fraught with frost and hail and snow. So this idea of what should be pure and simple in life has been thrown into a struggle. He's not asking for much. He's just asking, for love and connection and somewhere to belong. And he doesn't have that. And so, this is where we're taking, the symbolism of, what should be natural to man, nature, and how that nature of society is turned against him because he's been robbed of society. How loathsome become the frozen waves to a weary heart. In this brief world, I cannot wonder that my mind is set on melancholy, because I never forget the fate of men robbed of their riches, suddenly looted by death, the doom of the earth sent to us all by every rising sun. So here we have a return to the theme of material wealth, right? You could almost take right here this idea of men robbed of their riches and put it right beside that strong image yesterday of just dropping gold on the grave of a warrior. So there's a return to the theme of material wealth and the idea that that material wealth is temporary. We see this continue throughout these poems. Death is personified as a thief of all worldly goods, connects to yesterday's idea, and life is equated to an unescapable doom. So there's yesterday and today, right? Both of these poems, and we'll see it continue tomorrow, present this idea that worldly life is a struggle, and it's a struggle we're fated to endure. Wisdom is slow and comes but late. He who has it is patient. He cannot be hasty to hate or speak. He must be bold and yet not blind, nor ever too craven, complacent or covetous, nor ready to gloat before he wins glory. The man's a fool who flings his boast hotly to heaven, heeding his spleen, and not the better boldness of knowledge. And so we have this shift here from him describing what I'm suffering to my advice to you, the reader. So it becomes a sermon. And we see that evoked with the earlier poems. Here's another hint for the test. Those of you who watch this lecture is going to talk about, what is the religious message between these two poems and how does it relate? And here's where we see a lot of that connection happening as both men go from their personal story to their sermon to the speaker. So we have a repeated theme of noble silence. And again, that's directly dichotomous with that Anglo-Saxon virtue of boasting. This clearly shows an emphasis of shift from self to place in society, Loyalty has always been honored, but now servitude is the preferred attribute. So why is it? Think about again, how can we use the idea of stop boasting your own glory, but find comfort in serving others to supplement a religious message? Because it reinforces the goal of religious devotion to a monotheistic God. Man can only advance himself as is done in service to God. So this is going to set the pathway to where we're going next week. We're moving into the medieval period, and that medieval period is fully focused on this romanticized trait of servitude. We think about the medieval time, and what's the first image that comes to mind? I'm going to guess a knight, right? And a knight's entire purpose is to serve others. You know, he serves for God, he serves as king, he serves for the honor of all the ladies. And so this poem acts as a really good leeway between Anglo-Saxon virtues and what we're going to see emerge in medieval times. And not the better boldness of knowledge. Okay, what knowing man knows not the ghostly waste-like end of worldly wealth. See also the wreckage is there. The wind-swept walls stand far and wide, the storm-beaten blocks besmeared with frost. The mead halls crumbled, the monarchs thrown down and stripped of their pleasures. The proudest of warriors now lie by the wall, some of them war destroyed, some of the Okay, here are the different ways to die. Some of them war destroyed, some of the monstrous seabird bore over the ocean, some to the old wolf dealt out death, and for some dejected followers fashioned an earth cave coffin. Thus the maker of men lays waste, this earth crushing our callow mirth, and the work of old giants stands withered and still. All right, so how does this relate to the development of the poem thus far? What has he lost? How is he responding to that loss? You know, is it a message to him to comfort himself or comfort the reader? Because he's denouncing worldly possessions. He's denouncing even human relationships. But isn't that the very thing that this whole poem is mourning? So there's a little bit of, it's problematic here for me. It's kind of one of those to really simplify it. Are you practicing what you preach? And we're going to see the same thing happen tomorrow. And so maybe it's just a time of self-inflection. But here's this whole area where he's talking about this theme that very much connects to yesterday, that all of the great warriors are now dead, and all of the great halls are now crumbled, and all these lives were lost for nothing because time marches on. So the images, these ruined buildings that were once great, dead men who were once proud warriors, suggest that nothing earthly lasts, and that even the grandest human endeavors passes away, which, hint, hint, connects really well with the message from yesterday. This line, I think, of everything we read in the entire Anglo-Saxon unit, including Beowulf, is the greatest line. This earth crushing our callow mirth, and the work of old giants stands withered still. Forget the second line. Just look at the first line. This earth crushing our callow mirth. And so what does callow mean? Inexperienced and immature. It often refers to someone who's young. And mirth is this idea of laughter, just being amused, being happy. And so, you know, think about the symbolism that happens there as we shovel earth on the dead body, that, you know, our young ignorance, our, you know, the hollowness of seeking goodness in this life, of enjoying this life, of laughing, just having dirt shoveled on it because it's so hollow. It ultimately means nothing. We're young and ignorant. We don't know better. I mean, how is that message? All right. And He who these ruins rightly sees and deeply considers his dark twisted life, who sagely remembers the endless slaughters of a bloody past, who is bound to proclaim, where is the war steed? Where is the warrior? Where is his warlord? Where now the feasting places? Where now the mead hall pleasures? Alas, bright cup! Alas, brave knight! Alas, you glorious princes, all gone, lost in the night as you have never lived, and all that survives you is a serpentine wall, wondrously high, worked in strange ways. Mighty spears have slain these men, greedy weapons have framed their fate. These rocky slopes are beaten by storms, its earth pinned down by driving snow, by the horror of winter, smothering warm in the shadows of night. And the north angrily hurls its hailstones at our helpless heads. So, I mean, what a line of powerlessness there. Line 103, one you may want to look back to. You know, that the north, so up above, how north hurls its hailstones at our helpless heads. And again, that use of alliteration just to smoothly tie it together. And this idea of just nature, not nature physically in the poem with the hail, but just the nature of life and the nature of the world and human nature, and just how much it rains down on us, and we're just so helpless and we don't realize it. So the speaker is the lone survivor. He is the only one left to share this message. He sees all these great efforts laid to waste, all of his men, all of his brethren, his Lord now dead, you know, lost their lives over this land and these possessions that are left behind to rot and crumble. So what is his survival? There's a little bit of irony here, right? Because he's the fortunate one, he lived. But he's the only one that lived. And in living, he sees all that their lives were laid to waste for. So is he the fortunate one? Or are they? And I guess that is also going to really relate to belief in the afterlife. And is that happening here yet? I don't see it as clearly evident in this poem as the last, but there's definitely the message of what are you trading your earthly life for? All right, closing out this poem. Everything earthly is evilly born, firmly clutched by a fickle fate. Fortune vanishes, friendship vanishes, man is fleeting, woman is fleeting, and all this earth rolls into emptiness. So says the sage in his heart, sitting alone with his thought. It's good to guard your faith, nor let your grief come forth until it cannot call for help, nor help but heed the path you've placed before it. It's good to find your grace in God, the heavenly rock, where rests our every hope. So again, we see weather, an agent of nature, uses a metaphor, images of harsh winter landscapes and struggle, but that struggle is embraced. So typo there. This shifting tone follows a development seen in the Seafarer here, right? So in our closing message, we have a speaker who says, this is what life is. I mean, do you see now, I think I may have told you in passing, typically we read Macbeth in Shakespeare in 12th grade, but by the time we get there, we've just done so much dark literature that I just can't take it anymore. So we do like A Midsummer Night's Dream because it's fun and fairies and love and silliness and pranks, and we just need something positive to end the year on, because we begin the year with messages like everything earthly is evilly born. Fortune vanishes, friendship vanishes, man is fleeting, women is fleeting, and all this earth rolls into emptiness. You know, we are working our way out of the Anglo-Saxon era, but life is still harsh. And I guess they're finally at a point where, you know, man is thinking more and starting to question, why endure this? And I think we do that still, right? I mean, we still have people who question, if we have a loving God, why do we have war and death and disease and natural disasters? And, and different religions have different answers for that. But I think this is the first time that we see that happening to man. And it's causing a shift in the writing that we see. And it's here we're seeing the emergence of religion. But look what happens in very quickly in the medieval time with what we read in Canterbury Tales, how quickly they come to denounce religion and the people who represented it, because it's seen as such a thwarted enterprise early on. So at the end, our sage, our wise man, and his closing advice, not an optimistic message, but we don't expect optimistic messages during this time. So the wise man understands that it's best to take a conservative approach to life and all endeavors in life. Because all endeavors in life and even the best people in life ultimately pass away. The speaker views faith in God as a consolation for earthly suffering. So at the end of this, when we close the poem, our last poem closed with a prayer. It even said amen at the end. This one, however, has that strong shift. There was even a break in the poem that, we go from the story and the message, then we have a break. And it's almost like here's a sage. Here's this wise old man sitting on a rock talking to you, the audience. In case you've not gotten all I had to say, let me give it to you straightly. It is good to guard your faith. It is good not to let your grief come forth. Because if I grieve the hardships in this life, am I expressing faith in eternal life? That's an interesting paradox, right? We won't break into religion too much to discuss that, especially since I'd be discussing it with myself, and I'm rather agnostic, so it wouldn't be an entertaining discussion. But that's the message we're closing with, that we have a young warrior that's alone, and everything's been taken from him, and he has a life of suffering. He seems to be troubled by it more than our guy yesterday, but the message is the same, that this life is temporal, everything is temporary, that grief for this life shows irreverence to a God, because it means that this is the life I'm focused on, and that's not where your focus needs to be. You need to endure whatever struggles this worldly life gives you in order to receive the rewards later. So it is good to find your grace in God, the heavenly rock, where rests our every hope. And so, heavenly rock is interesting to look at how long ago, right? This is written in 945, I'm guessing there. Because that's, I think, a metaphor that's still used today, right? The rock. We even have a syndication of rock churches across the country. But think about how it fits in with what we've been talking about, right? That we have the imagery of rocks, literal rocks, used throughout both the poems we read. The crumbling rock of old towers. And then in this poem, it talks about, the ocean waves beating upon the cliffs and how it's worn away at these magnificent giant rocks. And so, all of this is temporal compared to the heavenly rock. And that's where focus on this life needs to be. So lots of connections between today's poem and yesterday's poem. And it's interesting because we could easily Venn diagram them, right? Let's kick it back to middle school here, and see how the shared message comes together. But it starts out with just two really opposing sides. From our guy yesterday, our seafarer, who rejected society, had that available to him, dipped his toes in, then ran. And our guy today, the wanderer, who has been removed from all society, forced to live in isolation, forced to remain silent about what he's witnessed and who he is. But then they both come back to the idea of this suffering has purpose. And again, think about anytime we look at literature, it's like we have to look at what's the purpose of it in society. And sometimes it's simply entertainment. But here, I think the fact that both of these come back with the same message, the purpose here, what this society was questioning is, why is life so hard? And this is the first time we start seeing them trying to answer that. And the answer is, it's hard because it's temporary. And it's almost a test, this struggle, to see what you're willing to endure, what you're capable of overcoming because of where you're going. So, all right, think about that tomorrow as you're working with the wife's lament. Remember, I warned you or told you in the very beginning that there's a short answer question with that reading that has the danger of becoming very generalized, because it asks you, what will these two men, what advice will they give this wife? And so you want to think about these themes that I kind of just sewn together for you. So, wow, yeah, you guys are going to make out really well if you go back and watch this, because I've kind of given you answers for everything. Feel free to keep down the download for those who choose not to. Hopefully tomorrow I'm going to trust in the greater world. You might see me coming to you live from the coffee shop if that's what it takes, because, you know, that would be such a burden. So we can finish out this week strong and look ahead to next week and the fun we're going to have with Canterbury Tales. So thank you guys for watching this, and I